Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Talapalava, Kia orana, Bulavinaka, Yahweh, Kasalelea, what else? Kia orana, Yorana. Hopefully, I ran out of all the hellos there is possibly in the Pacific Island language. But basically, good afternoon. Thank you for coming and joining us from across the region. Today, sadly, is our last webinar module for the second round of training delivered to you by the compliments of the Pacific Learning Partnership for Environmental and Social Sustainability. We've got today an exciting topic for you all. Today is module 16. It's titled Preventing Gender-Based Violence, Sexual Exploitation and Abuse, and Sexual Harassment in a Project Environment. I have to confess, this is the topic is not necessarily new for me, but I would consider myself a novice. So I am looking absolutely forward to learning as much as possible from the expert herself, beaming all the way from Australia, Tessa Walsh. So Tessa joins us together with Rachel Marburg from the World Bank, and they will be our key trainers for this last session. So let me read a bit of the narrative that inspired us around this topic to deliver to you. In addition to this is something that you've also wanted from the evaluations we did for the first round of training. So gender-based violence, or GBV, is an umbrella term for any harmful act that is perpetrated against a person's will, and that is based on socially ascribed, for example, gender differences between males and females. Now, this includes acts that inflict physical, sexual, or mental harm or suffering, threats of acts, coercion, and other deprivations of liberty. So these acts can occur in public or private and can potentially take place through project activities if left unscreened. So for its part, the World Bank exercises zero tolerance towards gender-based violence, sexual exploitation and abuse, and sexual harassment in the context of its development work. So the bank, as a response to that, has strengthened its approach to management and prevention of gender-based violence, sexual exploitation and abuse, and sexual harassment. So today we are joined with us from Australia, Tessa Walsh. She's an expert in this area, and she will be taking us through the presentation. Like before, please use the chat box. I would really love for you guys to use the video, but most of you are shy. We can work with the chat box, and please do raise any comments, observations, or questions, or anything you need clarifications along the way. I'm sure my colleagues Tessa and Rachel will be happy to respond in real time. Over to you, Tessa. Good luck. I'm about to put on my learning cap, and over to you. Thank you.
Okay, hello everyone. Sorry, bear with me while I just bring my screen up for you. Okay. Oh, please look. Okay, well, while it looks like my computer is catching up with my share screening. A little bit of background about me. So my name's Tess. I am Australian, but I'm joining you from Fiji. I have the great privilege of living and working in Fiji, which I really can't complain about, particularly during COVID. My background is in addressing violence against women. I've been working in this area for the last, I think, around 15 years, and I've been living and working in the Pacific for the last, I think, 11 or 12 years, and have kind of worked with a range of different stakeholders across different areas with services and in prevention programming and around legislation. And then more recently, a lot more of this kind of work in both the private sector, but also some of this kind of workplace-based work, and have been providing support to the World Bank over the last couple of years around integrating gender-based violence into the projects, particularly in the Pacific. So today, I'm going to take you through a bit of an introduction to gender-based violence in the Pacific more broadly, and then talk a little bit about what the bank has in place in terms of risk mitigation and risk response. I can see I'm having a little bit of a delay between my screen and the PowerPoint, so just bear with me. I'll just get started though. So when it comes to gender-based violence is the umbrella term for any form of violence against women directed against somebody because of their gender. So the social differences between females and males. And gender-based violence can be physical, sexual, emotional, psychological, financial, and spiritual. Just to get you all starting so that I'm not talking too much, who are the majority of victim survivors of gender-based violence? Anyone wants to jump in?
Women.
Thank you, Edwin. Women are the majority of survivors of gender-based violence, and who are the majority of perpetrators of gender-based violence?
Men.
Correct. Men are the majority of perpetrators of gender-based violence, whether the victim is a woman or a man. So even where men are targets of gender-based violence, the majority of perpetrators are overwhelmingly men. What's the most common form of violence that women in the Pacific experience?
Domestic violence.
You're an easy team to work with. Correct. Domestic violence is the most common form of violence that women in the Pacific experience. So overwhelmingly, as a region, domestic violence is the most common form of violence that women experience. Women report experiencing. So that being both intimate partner violence, where the perpetrator is a current or former partner, but also includes other forms of domestic violence or family violence, where the perpetrator is another family member. So for example, a father or father-in-law, brother, brother-in-law, uncles, other male family members. What's the difference between gender-based violence and violence against women?
Well, I guess it's because gender-based violence can be directed at anyone because of their gender. So men can also be the targets, whereas violence against women is specifically targeting women.
Thanks, Wendy. Anyone else want to jump in on this one with another difference between gender-based violence and violence against women?
I think Wendy really covered it well, what she said.
So originally, the shift towards using gender-based violence was also to highlight the gender dimension of the violence, so that the root cause of the violence is based on gender and based on gender inequality. But in the Pacific, what does tend to happen a little bit is that gender-based violence is used in place of violence against women to adopt more gender-neutral language. So it takes focus away from women being the majority of victims and men being the majority of perpetrators. So in some countries in particular, where they have shifted to be using gender-based violence, if you talk to kind of key people in government around why that shift happened, it is kind of more deliberate to take away the gendered focus of the violence. But Wendy's also correct that technically gender-based violence is inclusive of other forms of gender-based violence, not just those that target women. So it also includes violence that targets men and other gender identities because of their gender. So for example, communities with diverse sexual orientations and gender identities and expressions are also a group that commonly experiences gender-based violence in addition to women. But I think in the Pacific, it's probably fair to say that in most contexts and in most countries, even where gender-based violence is being used, the interventions that it's being used to explain are usually still interventions focused on violence against women, with maybe the exception of maybe Samoa and Tonga and Fiji, where the work has become more broader and a bit more inclusive around other forms of gender-based violence. Mostly what people refer to as gender-based violence programming is really programming around violence against women. And please just jump in at any time if you have any questions, comments. So what we know about violence against women in the Pacific is that the rates are very high. So as a region, the Pacific has one of the kind of highest overall rates when comparing kind of regions across the world. The Pacific's rates of violence against women are some of the highest in the world. What you've got here are the rates of intimate partner violence specifically. So where women have reported violence, either physical or sexual, by an intimate partner, so being both a current or former partner during their lifetime. And you can see I've grouped the data around the sub-regions. So you can see for the Melanesian countries, they are kind of all sitting at a quite similar rate. It's a little bit similar with Polynesia, whereas with Micronesia, we see a bit more variation within the sub-region itself. This information, all of it except for Papua New Guinea and Tuvalu, comes from standalone family health and safety.
Oh, that's pretty.
Right, I've lost you.
What's the survey sample?
That's happened in the region where we now have, for most countries, national prevalence data in some form. In the case of PNG and Tuvalu, they haven't done a standalone survey on violence against women, but they've included the domestic violence module within their demographic health survey. So that's what data is being used here. Once we start looking, go ahead.
Hi, Jessica, can you go back to this? Can you, I'm just trying to understand that those numbers a bit more. So if I'm looking at more, 46% of those who were 46% of those who were surveyed, or 46% of the national population, or well, what are those numbers meaning here?
Yeah, it's 46% of the women who were surveyed, but it's a nationally representative survey. So the 46% represents the population.
Wow, that's a very high number.
Yeah.
Oh. All right,
yeah.
thank you.
So yeah. So Kiribati has the highest, up at 68%, and then the Melanesian countries are quite similar to Kiribati. And then you've got some lower rates in some of the smaller Micronesian countries as well.
Of course, it doesn't tell us what age these respondents were, or so did it include girls as well as women, or only women?
No.
And what age?
So it only included adult women, and they were asked about their experience of violence from the age of 15 onwards. And the Violence Against Women survey, they also get asked about childhood experience of sexual violence, which is reported separately. But this particular statistic is asking women over the age of 18 whether they'd experienced physical or sexual violence since the age of 15 in their lifetime. So there's also data within the surveys that shows how many women had experienced violence in the past 12 months as well. And there's also a lot of breakdown as well around who the perpetrator is. So you've got the former and current partner, but then also with the other data around broader domestic violence or other violence, it also breaks down by perpetrator as well. I don't think, besides where it asked about childhood experience of sexual violence, I think it does break up as well. I think there is disaggregation as well around what age they were from memory, but I might be wrong about that. And the data was published since 20, I think the first one, Samoa, was maybe around 2006, possibly 2005 or 2006. Then Kiribati and Solomons were 2007, 8, 9. And then the others have all come in between. The PNG data is the most recent. That report was just released in 2019, and the data is from 2017 and 2016. The Kiribati has recently redone the domestic violence module as part of another population survey. And that's happening in a couple of countries at the moment. So a couple of countries are rerunning only the domestic violence module. So they're not rerunning the whole survey, they're just running some questions from the methodology. So there will be some more recent data that comes out over the next couple of years. And I think Fiji, Vanuatu and Samoa, if I'm remembering right, are all redoing the full survey again over the next couple of years as well. So there will be some refreshed data coming out over the next couple of years. So then when we look at non-partner violence, so data around women's experience of non-partner physical violence and non-partner sexual violence, the data is not as consistent across all the countries in terms of who asked which questions. So in some countries, we have more kind of data across different forms of violence against women than others. And in some cases, the surveys that were done only asked about intimate partner violence. It didn't ask about other forms of violence. But you can see here that there's a bit more variation once we start looking at non-partner violence. And non-partner violence does include, in some cases, other forms of domestic violence. So this would include family members that aren't the intimate partner as well. But it does also include other forms of violence where it's not a family member who's the perpetrator as well. So when it comes to violence against women in the Pacific and some of the specific dynamics that are happening within the region that I think are helpful to know about when thinking about the Banks projects. So what we've already talked about, there's a really high prevalence of violence against women. So even though it's kind of the highest prevalence is around intimate partner violence and domestic violence, what we know about the high prevalence of the forms of violence within the family indicate that there's probably high levels of violence in other kind of spheres of women's lives as well. The absence of specific data, around sexual harassment or around sexual violence, or in particular locations like girls' experience of violence in schools. Even though we don't have kind of specific prevalence data that speaks to all these different forms of violence, what we can see in the information that we have indicates that rates of violence are also high in kind of other areas. And that's backed up by what women's crisis services report as well, in terms of what they hear in terms of the clients and women coming to them as well. So what that means is that there's an increased likelihood of violence against women occurring within the World Bank projects because you're in a context where there's already a high level of violence occurring generally. And this also relates to attitudes and social norms that excuse and perpetuate violence against women, which remain common across the region, and they're reinforced by cultural, traditional and religious norms. So these attitudes remain common in the Pacific, and the prevalence surveys ask questions about attitudes. So there is also kind of data that backs this up that shows the high level of acceptance of violence against women. In some countries, both women and men were asked the questions around attitudes, and in other countries, only women were asked. But we do know that generally the attitudes are quite strong. And it does mean that within the project workers are likely to bring those attitudes with them into the workplace. And even though we're talking about the Pacific and that these attitudes remain quite strong and common in the Pacific, they remain strong and common all over the world. you know, for me as a, you know, white Anglo-Australian, they're still strong in Australia. So when foreigners are also coming into the Pacific, they're bringing the same kinds of attitudes. It's not something that is just kind of limited to culture in the Pacific. And then on top of that, when you've got foreigners coming in, they can also bring kind of attitudes about culture in the Pacific that are unhelpful when it comes to violence against women as well. You know, we see kind of attitudes around that this is just something that's common and acceptable in the Pacific. So it's not such a kind of considered such a serious issue. There's also limited services and specialist services for survivors of violence against women. So it varies by country around what services are available. And there's a few countries in the region that have long established services that have been in place for kind of 10, 20 years. But those countries until recently have been quite limited. Over the last 5 years, there's been an investment in building up services in countries where there weren't specialist services. So recently we've seen more services, for example, in the North Pacific, which for a very long time was quite a big gap. But over the last couple of years, there's been a greater investment in the North Pacific and in some of the smaller countries as well, where there hadn't been kind of support for specialist services. But having said that, there's still locations where there's limited or no services at all. So even, for example, you know, Fiji and Vanuatu probably have the best outreach in terms of coverage across the countries. But outside Vanuatu and Fiji, once you're moving into rural and remote areas, there's often limited or no services in those locations, or what's available is quite informal, so it's not structured formal services the way that we see in urban centres or even in larger town centres.
Tessa, can I ask a question on that? So you've mentioned, you know, the attitudes and cultural norms and religion or traditions and how they can, that can be carried with us across the region. Can you comment a little bit on any of those things that help protect against forms of violence? Are there ways that traditions might be valuable in terms of considering how to prevent or, you know, support victims of gender-based violence?
Yeah, so it can be. So there are kind of protections or there's practices that do happen at those informal levels that do kind of put protections in place for women or do have levels of accountability. But I think that they're quite few and far between. So I guess where I've seen them work is where there's kind of strong women's activists and advocates in those communities who are advocating for other women and also advocating for interpretations of cultural practices that aren't harmful towards women. So you see it a little bit with, say, in some of the Melanesian countries that have bride price, say PNG or Solomon Islands. Generally, the practice is something that is harmful towards women, and in the context of violence against women is harmful. It can limit their ability to leave. But there's examples of women leaders who are trying to transform those practices to what they would advocate is how they were before, where it is more around protecting women, and it is around that the families, if you are paying bride price, you are then responsible for her. So if she is harmed as in that marriage, the family is responsible rather than it being a burden. So I think there are examples of it, but I think it's difficult because generally speaking, a lot of the cultural practices are still harmful for women. So I think that there's an opportunity to transform them and to take the parts that are more positive and kind of transform the parts that are harming women. But I think that there's also effort needed to facilitate that process. And I guess where I've seen it work the best is where you've got women's rights kind of activists who are part of accountability and making sure that those processes are working better for women. I don't know if that answers.
Could I just say something about the word tradition?
Go ahead, Wendy. Can you put on your video, please?
Hello.
Hello, Wendy. Go ahead.
I'm a little worried about the use of the term tradition because it implies that a lot of these practices are very old and that they are rooted in culture and that they haven't changed. And in actual fact, that's being very strongly contested all over the Pacific and even in New Zealand too, where there has been such a transformation of gender relations during colonialism that it's a very it's easy to say, oh, these are old customs that are not helpful for women and we should get rid of them. But some of them aren't old at all. People think they're old, but some of them have been profoundly altered by Western interference or different kinds of colonialism and the church and all kinds of other institutions that have come into the Pacific. So I think, you know, that we can talk about norms in the culture, we can talk about practices, we can talk about that kind of thing, but the moment you stick the label traditional on it, it begins to sound like this is an unchanging Pacific problem that goes back centuries and that is rooted in particular cultures. And of course, some might be more prone to those kinds of harmful practices than others, but we shouldn't think of them as being static and not dynamic. They have changed a great deal over time.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree. I think, I mean, just to jump in, there are many times I hear folks sort of use the default position that it's traditional, it's customs, and I, as a Pacific Islander, I could verify that through personal and informal conversation. So if it comes out that way, it's because the folks in the Pacific Islands are probably using that as a default definition. And I do, so from that angle, I do sort of understand where Tessa is coming from. But another point is sort of, it's to really, I take Wendy's comment. It's some of these things aren't really traditional if you unpack it, and then it's really nothing to do with our customs and the norms that we were handed down from our ancestors. So I on that note, I think we need to be careful on it. But certainly moving forward, what I have seen in literature, what I hear, they just said, oh, it's customary. Oh, they say the man is the head of the house, and therefore, they assume this overall supreme leadership. So I think, it's really having also to contextualize what this, the culture properly for what it really means. It's an important step to understanding local context and how that would frame how you engage in these sort of issues. That's just a point I wanted to make. But I've got a comment from Miniasi Tessa. No condemnation, but where do LGBTQ plus fall when this issue of preventing gender-based violence is? Are there victims of preventing gender-based violence? Any response to that, please?
Yeah, so just to close off on the cultural stuff, and then I'll come to the LGBTQI issues. So, I think it's a good pull up for me around, because I didn't clarify when I talked about culture what I was talking about. So it's, it's true that the cultures in the Pacific enable, promote, perpetuate violence against women, but it's also true that my white Australian culture perpetuates, enables, and reinforces violence against women as well. And it's not something that is specific to the Pacific at all. And it is something that is kind of has evolved, and colonialism has had impacts on violence against women. But one of the things that I also hear in the Pacific, which I think also needs to be pushed back upon, is that often I hear this narrative that none of this happened before colonialism. So before colonialism, we protected women and none of these things happened to women. And I don't think that that's true either. I think that just because maybe there's not the documentation of it the way that we have it now, to also pretend like these things didn't happen when it's been happening all over the world for, you know, for as long as. I also don't think it's fair to kind of have a narrative as well that this is a new issue that came with colonialism and came with the church and came with modernity as well. So I think that there is some kind of, it is something that has changed over time, absolutely, and there's been different things that have impacted on violence against women. But I do also think that it's something that has been long ingrained in societies, not just in the Pacific, for a long time. Where it comes, so for LGBTQI issues, so as I mentioned at the beginning, when we talk about gender-based violence, it's you know, in theory, the language of gender-based violence includes communities with diverse sexual orientation and diverse gender identities and expressions. So in theory, this work is supposed to be inclusive of issues around homophobia and transphobia and the violence that is targeted against other groups because of their sexuality and gender identity as well. I think that it's not something that has been particularly well integrated, and not just in the Pacific. I think it's something that when I worked on violence against women in Australia, it was something that was still a challenge between the women's movement and between SOGI movements as well, around how to be working more cohesively. I think that there is some evidence of it in the Pacific of, I've done some stuff recently where I've seen kind of more integration, particularly I think maybe in Fiji and in Tonga, I've seen it probably more, it's fair to say, and that there's more integration between, for example, the women's crisis services working with, for example, transgender organisations as well, and working together around referrals and support to survivors. But I think it's probably more recent. And I think it's also difficult, particularly in some countries in the Pacific, say some of the Melanesian countries where some of the behaviours are still criminalised. It makes it really hard for groups to come forward and participate in the same way as well. So I don't think I've answered the question. I think I think it's an area that there hasn't been quite as much work in the Pacific, but I think also when I worked in Australia, it was also an area where it was still kind of coming together, I would say. I'm not sure if I've answered your question, Aminasi.
Oh, good, Tessa, no worries. We've got heaps of time for others to join in. Please continue with your presentation. Thanks, Aminasi.
So one of the other issues around context is that most survivors don't report violence against women to formal services. So one of the things that the national survey showed us is that women overwhelmingly don't tell anyone about the violence that happened to them. And then when they did tell someone, they told the church, or they told a friend or family member, or they might have told someone in the community. But overwhelmingly, they weren't reporting to formal services. So they weren't reporting to the police. They also weren't reporting to women's crisis centres at high rates. So even though the women's crisis centres have high demand on their service, I guess compared to the number of women who were reporting that they experienced violence, the majority weren't reporting it. So across countries, you'll kind of see 60, 70% of women who experienced violence didn't tell anyone what had happened to them. So how that affects World Bank projects is that it does reduce the likelihood that survivors are going to report something if it does occur, because we know generally that women aren't reporting the violence that they're experiencing. And there's lots of reasons why that's happening. So it's not, I guess it's not an easy thing to unpack. There's a lot of socioeconomic barriers. There's a lot of attitudinal barriers. There's a lot of structural barriers around the response that they get when they do report. So the reason that they're not reporting is also not, it's kind of complicated and multi-layered, all the different factors that are kind of being the kind of narrative that women are told, which results in them not reporting the violence that's happening. There's also challenges around effectively implementing legislation related to violence against women. So another one of the significant things that's happened in the time that I've been working in the region is that there's been a focus on strengthening the legislative frameworks. So there's been focus on putting in place domestic violence specific legislation. So even though domestic violence was a crime before under the criminal codes, whether it was assault or sexual violence, having domestic violence specific legislation has increased access to protection orders and has also kind of increased focus on the criminal nature of domestic violence. So that's been a real focus kind of over the last 10 years in terms of legislative reform, but there's still a lot of challenges effectively implementing that legislation, a lot of which have to do with the police and the courts and how they're still responding to cases of violence against women and not perhaps taking it as seriously as they should. And this means that where there are instances of violence against women that happen, for example, within the context of a project, you can't rely on the formal justice system to hold the perpetrator accountable, because in most cases there's still impunity for violence against women. I think one of the reasons that I guess I like doing work that's around kind of these workplace responses is because it means that there can be an accountability when all these other things fail women. So often men don't get any messages when they're being violent that what they're doing is not acceptable. If there can be a consequence, it does help send messages that it's not acceptable. So even if that consequence is something within their employment and within their workplace, it's something that's sending a message that what they're doing isn't okay, even if all these other kind of mechanisms are failing to be enforced effectively. And then the last one is that the World Bank operates in male-dominated sectors. So in a number of cases, the bank is working in sectors that are predominantly male or almost male, and where women are going to be a minority within the workplace. And we know that in male-dominated sectors, there's more likely to be an environment where violence against women is more common and more accepted. So we see this with sexual harassment, that sexual harassment is more common in male-dominated sectors, and women who are working in those sectors who experience sexual harassment are less likely to report what they're experiencing. And when they do report it, they're less likely to get a positive response from their employer. So we know that male-dominated sectors also have particular challenges to overcome when it comes to both preventing violence from happening within the sector and also the response that they're giving to women who do come forward and report what they're experiencing. Any other questions before I pause for a minute? Okay, so when we're looking at the types of violence against women that might be exacerbated by World Bank projects, so I'm not suggesting at all that World Bank projects cause violence against women. The violence is existing in society already, and the root cause is related to gender inequality. What the World Bank projects do is that they can exacerbate the existing conditions, which then can provide opportunities for violence that either wasn't there before or an increase in violence that was already occurring. So I've tried to kind of group it around the different types of violence that I guess might occur in the context of World Bank projects. So you've got your first group in that purpley pinky colour, which is around the project workers themselves. So there's violence that the project workers might be using that relates to their employment on a project. So in particular, it relates to where there's opportunities for them to exploit the power that they have or abuse the increased power that they have as a result of their position working within the project. So this mostly relates to sexual exploitation, sexual abuse, and sexual harassment, which I'll go into next. So there's those forms of violence that relate to the project workers themselves. Then there's other forms of violence that women engaging with the project might be experiencing. So we know that women generally in the Pacific are experiencing higher rates of domestic violence. Whenever there's any kind of activity or program that's working with women, it's safe to assume that some of the women participating in that program were already experiencing domestic violence. Then there's some kind of situations that can potentially increase women's experience of domestic violence, particularly where we start pushing back and challenging gender inequality. One of the ways that men can reassert control is through domestic violence. So we can see sometimes one of the ways men react to women's increased empowerment is through violence. So whether that's violence in public places in terms of sexual violence or sexual harassment, or violence and control within their relationships or within their families as well. Then there's also violence that women might experience in public places while accessing a project. So this is both violence that might kind of already be happening within a context. So for example, women already experience sexual harassment or sexual violence while in public spaces generally. So it means that generally if they're maybe traveling somewhere to access a program, they might experience violence that is happening more generally towards women in the community. But also there might be aspects similar related to a project that might increase their risk of experiencing violence. So for example, if you had cash transfers and women were having to travel somewhere to receive that transfer, they might then be targets of violence in terms of theft. So there's also kind of specific safety issues that might come up for specific projects. And then there's sector-specific risks. So the easiest one to identify is probably around human trafficking, and within the maritime sector, that in some countries in the Pacific, human trafficking within the maritime sector is quite high. It's not the case in all Pacific countries, though. It is kind of particular countries that where there's more human trafficking happening within, for example, the fishing vessels. So in some cases, there might be something that is sector specific in terms of World Bank projects. So when it comes to what the bank can do, what the bank is responsible for, when it comes to the project workers, it's where the bank has the most control in terms of setting clear expectations to prevent their use of violence and also to hold them accountable within the workplace when they do use violence. So the project workers, I guess, is where the World Bank has the most kind of control in terms of what they can do to mitigate and to respond to risks of violence against women. And then when it comes to other forms of violence against women that women engaging with projects might be experiencing, in these cases, the link to the project is less direct in that in a lot of cases, the violence that women are experiencing, they were experiencing before participating in the project. They'll continue to experience it during and after the project. And the project hasn't necessarily increased their kind of risk or exposure to violence. So in these cases, it is more around putting in place strategies to try to reduce risks where possible, but also being able to provide information to women about their rights and being able to access services. So because we know that women are experiencing violence, if we're doing activities with women, you know, sharing information about services, sharing information about their rights is one way that we can kind of increase women's knowledge and potentially access to services as well. And then with your sector-specific risks, there might be opportunities to support the sector to more proactive around the prevention and response of violence against women. So the maritime sector, again, is a kind of easy example because often with some of the human trafficking that has happened, it hasn't actually focused in the maritime sector. So you might have a human trafficking program happening in a country, but the maritime sector hasn't been heavily involved, doesn't have kind of specific procedures around what they should do. So there's potentially an opportunity to strengthen or expand existing efforts that are happening to a particular sector. So then what I'm going to focus on for the rest of the time together is really on the sexual exploitation, abuse and sexual harassment, which is where the World Bank, I guess, has a bit more control, and also where the safeguards and requirements are built around, because the bank as well, I guess, is also more directly accountable for the violence that might happen within their own workforces or as well, or within the workforces of the projects. And I think I'll go to the next one because I think it probably answers the question I can see there around strategies to encourage and promote women and men working together. And then I'll pause again. So I'm going to focus on the prevention, mitigation and responding strategies for sexual exploitation, abuse and sexual harassment. But I just guess, generally speaking, there's opportunities within projects to also work more broadly around contributing to preventing and responding to violence against women. So one is the one I've mentioned. Whenever we're working with a group of women, there's an opportunity to share information around their rights, to share information about how to access services, to bring services in. So there's always an opportunity when you're working with women to include information and service accessibility as part of the program. There also can be opportunities to engage men to promote non-violence and gender equitable norms. So, for example, any opportunity to promote men doing more care work, more unpaid work is a bonus, and that's contributing to gender inequality as well as contributing to preventing violence against women. And there's also, for example, opportunities to work with men to increase their support for women's empowerment. So to actively engage men around increasing women's access to resources, access to decision-making and access to privileges. So it's those kinds of opportunities where we're looking at preventing violence against women, but also you're looking at gender inequality and promoting gender inequality more broadly as well. So for the World Bank, there's a focus on preventing and responding to sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment. So just a moment on definitions. When we're talking about sexual exploitation, it's any actual or attempted abuse of a position of vulnerability, differential power or trust for sexual purposes. So basically, for example, exchanging sex or sexual favors for something. So whether it's for money or for goods or for opportunities, but you're taking an advantage of an increased position of power. So in the context of, say, your project workers going into a community, they have increased income potentially, they have increased status if they're going into a community that's not theirs. You can have, either perceived status in that the community is going to perceive that they might have resources or have status, or they might actually have resources and status. And the workers can take advantage of that in the case of, for example, sexually exploiting women or sexually exploiting men in the community as well. And then you've got sexual abuse, which is the actual threatened physical intrusion of a sexual nature, whether by force or unequal coercive conditions. So this is basically sexual assault. So any kind of physical sexual violence, basically. So it includes rape and attempted rape, but it also includes other forms of physical sexual assault, unwanted touching and those kinds of things. All of those things are examples of sexual abuse. And then sexual harassment is the unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors or other verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature. So this includes your kind of non-physical forms of sexual advances. That might be comments, it might be images, it might be kind of touching people, might be staring or bodily gestures that aren't verbal or physical as well, all those kinds of forms of sexual harassment. So all three of these could be used by project workers towards members of the community. So whether it's sexual exploitation, sexual abuse or sexual harassment, When it comes to within the workforces itself, so within, for example, the contractors' workforces, that is counted as sexual harassment. So in the case of sexual exploitation or sexual abuse within the workforce, it's also sexual harassment. So it all kind of gets bundled up together as sexual harassment. So in the workplace, it can range from your less severe forms of non-verbal or verbal harassment all the way through to your sexual abuse and sexual assault and the exchange of sexual favours for employment benefits. One of the things I've seen sometimes how the bank expresses the separation is that sexual harassment happens within the workforce and sexual exploitation and abuse happen between the workers and the community. But I think that misses the sexual harassment that can also happen between the workers and the community. So those less severe forms of sexual violence, like the comments, like the like the comments and the staring and those things that might make women uncomfortable in the community, are also sexual harassment by project workers. So just explaining that in case you see it expressed differently, that I'm expressing it a little bit differently here. So when it comes to what the bank has in place around mitigating and responding to risks of sexual exploitation, abuse and sexual harassment particularly, it's most developed, I think it's fair to say, within the civil works sector. So there's been a good practice note that's been in place for quite a few years now and was just reviewed and released again last year. So this steps through what projects need to do to mitigate and respond to risks of sexual exploitation, abuse and sexual harassment particularly. So, and it steps through project preparation and project implementation, and it's broken into processes around assessing the risk, addressing the risk, which is also your kind of prevention strategies, and then also responding to any incidences of sexual exploitation, abuse and sexual harassment that happen within projects. So there's a risk assessment tool which determines the level of risk for the project, and that then sets kind of your standard of what actions are required for a project. But then there's also actions that are required across all projects regardless of the risk level. So I'm just going to take you through examples of what those are now across the assess, address and respond. So generally speaking, when we're looking at assessing the risk, there's a risk assessment process, there's a tool that then kind of prompts risk assessments to be integrated into different aspects of the safeguarding tool. And there's a process to identify the service providers that are available in particular locations. Then we're looking at addressing the risk. The requirements around sexual exploitation, abuse and sexual harassment are embedded within the procurement process. There's, I guess, expectations around making sure that the implementing agencies have capacity to adhere to the sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment requirements. And then there's specific risk prevention and mitigation measures that are outlined within an action plan. When it comes to responding to incidences of sexual exploitation, abuse and sexual harassment within projects, there's kind of two overarching actions. One is around making sure the referrals can be made to specialist services. So they're services, you know, external services like your police, health services, counselling services, safe houses. And then there's the process within the grievance mechanism as well, to manage the complaint and the breach of code of conduct that has happened if sexual exploitation, abuse and sexual harassment have occurred. So, for example, examples of actions to assess the risks of sexual exploitation, abuse and sexual harassment related to the project. On the World Bank side, there's a risk assessment tool that I mentioned. So that tool includes both questions around the context that are like pre-filled and set which is about the broader context of violence against women and the broader kind of context of legislation and services within a country. And then there's particular questions that get asked about the project. And the outcome of that is a risk rating, which then prompts which actions need to be followed. And the World Bank also needs to sensitise the implementing agencies to the sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment requirements as well. Then for the implementing agency, there's a process of identifying service providers for each project site. So the project should be able to, for each project site, make a referral in the case that a survivor reports violence to them. So that's whether it's violence that relates to the project or whether if someone were to report gender-based violence that's not related to the project at all. So for any project site, there should be a list of service providers that then somebody can be referred to immediately without kind of delay. So part of the assessment process is to do that kind of mapping, I guess, of what services are available. Then the risks around sexual exploitation, abuse and sexual harassment are put into a range of safeguards documents as well. So they're documented through the process. Then a sexual exploitation, abuse and sexual harassment action plan is developed. So this isn't required, I think, for low risk projects, but I guess I would suggest it as being a pretty good practice generally, even for low risk projects, particularly because in some Pacific countries, you might have a low risk project, but there's still an issue around access to services. Or so I guess having the plan just kind of keeps that check in place to make sure that even if the project is low risk, that there's actions built in to make sure that it's responding to the context as well. And also there's consultation on the risk mitigation and response strategies. So by consultation, I advocate that this isn't consultation with the communities, this is consultation with service providers. So as much as possible to reduce consultation with women and asking women themselves about their experience of violence. Just, you know, generally, we've spent a lot of time asking women to share their stories and they often don't get a lot of benefit from it. And service providers can give most information on behalf of survivors. So the intention to talk with service providers rather than survivors is around kind of the ethics of continuing to ask women to share when they're not kind of often, especially if we're looking at places where there's no services, we're asking women to share, but we're not able to offer what they need because it's not available as well. So there's kind of some ethical questions around continuing to ask women about their experience when we're not actually able to kind of change their situation or help access services. So the consultation being with service providers or other kind of key stakeholders who are able to give information without having to go to women themselves and ask and consult again. And then the contractors as well need to include the risk mitigation and response strategies into their safeguards documents as well. So depending on the level of risk, there's also a need to include strategies within the stakeholder engagement plan as well at the assessment stage. When it comes to actions to address the risks, so this is also mostly your prevention strategies. So the next one is really the response in terms of responding after an incident has occurred. The addressing strategies are mostly focused on how we're going to try and prevent violence from happening. So for the World Bank, it's around making sure that the IAs have capacity to implement strategies around the prevention and response to risks of sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment. When it comes to the actual prevention strategies, they really centre around the code of conduct. So having a code of conduct in place that explicitly prohibits sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment. So it has specific mention of sexual harassment, sexual abuse, sexual exploitation within the code of conduct. Then there's inductions with the workers on those components of the code of conduct specifically. And there's also awareness done with the community so that they're aware both of the code of conduct and how to make a complaint in the case that something happens. So your implementing agency has kind of the overarching oversight to make sure that that's happening. But because the contractors are the ones employing the workers, they're the ones that have to make sure that their workers sign the code of conduct, that they've done the induction, and that community awareness is happening for the communities where they're responsible for them. When it comes to higher risk projects, so particularly at substantial and high risk, there's also an expectation that the implementing agency and supervising engineer has GBV specialists within their team. I think this one can maybe be a little bit of a challenge in the Pacific because of resources, and often the teams are quite small. So for example, you might have a GBV specialist within the supervising engineer, but it might not be realistic to have one within the implementing agency as well. But for the high risk projects, there does need to be some expertise within the team as well. Wendy, there are examples of the codes of conduct. So I think the ones from maybe Vanuatu used to be on the website, but there's also, we've simplified it. There's a more simplified version now, which is just one code of conduct, which before there was 3 different codes of conduct for managers, contractors and workers. But we've got kind of a single one now, which all the workers would sign.
Tessa, can I just jump in here to talk a little bit about risk in the Pacific and how it's in relation to the tool? Is that cutting you off from anything you were going to discuss?
Go ahead.
Great, thank you. Firstly, we can share the code of conduct. In fact, Mia Pello, I'll share that with you, and it can go on the PNEA website along with all the presentations. So Wendy will definitely make sure you can have a copy of that. It is generic and can be tailored, of course, but of course we can share that with you. Tessa has mentioned the risk assessment tool that the bank kind of uses. And I just wanted to kind of clarify how we use it and who uses it and what it's told us so far. So firstly, it's an internal tool. And it's a bit frustrating, I can imagine, that this sort of thing sits behind the World Bank facade and we don't share it with you. We absolutely share the results with World Bank projects. But the reason is because it's a starting point. And what it does is it's just a sort of a spreadsheet. It's nothing fancy, but it talks about the context risk in a country. And it will talk about issues like availability of services or laws preventing violence or some of the systematic issues. And this is a global tool, so all of that work has been done globally to sort of include in the tool. And then my job, for example, would be to look at the project, answer some project questions, and then the tool spits out a number. And internally across the bank, everybody feels the numbers are wrong. Now, I'm not trying to sort of tell on the bank, but the point is that it's a starting point for a conversation. It's not something that is absolute. It's not something that works very well everywhere. It's not something that we do and tick and away we go. There's always the need for other conversations. And for us as specialists working in the Pacific, we talk a lot to our project counterparts to have a think about what this assessment is telling us. Do we think it feels right? Do we think it doesn't feel right? What are the issues it doesn't consider? What are the things that in a particular context we need to be more concerned about versus less concerned about? So it's really just to start the conversation. But we do have these risk levels, and they low, moderate, significant, and high risk, substantial, sorry, and high risk. And what I can tell you, and Tessa has been really clear up front in this presentation, and we know the rates of gender-based violence, are quite high in the Pacific, but many of the projects, in fact, I would say sort of 90% of the projects fall in a low or a moderate risk And that's because these are global tools, and you can imagine the scale of the project that you might have in the Pacific is very, very different from the mega projects we might do in countries like India or in China or in Africa, where literally there are millions of people affected by a project. So the scale is completely different. So what we see is the tool telling us there's low risk, but we also know that there are things that we have to do in our projects to mitigate the risk of exacerbating any existing violence, and to make sure that the project itself, like it does on environment and social risk, is also thinking about the sexual exploitation and abuse issues that it may perpetrate, and that it has a system to manage it. So it fits within that wider idea of understanding and assessing, and then doing something to make sure we're mitigating those impacts. So we don't necessarily have high-risk projects, but we do know that this is something that we need to actively manage. And so the tool and the process is really just a way of getting us to think about this issue and to make sure we have appropriate responses. And so in the Pacific, they have to be relevant to the Pacific. So even though there's sort of a set of tools that we use, that there's a set of things that we like to see on projects, we are very, very keen to make sure they're relevant to the Pacific context. And so we work really closely with projects, and Tessa supports us to do that, to make sure that these are relevant and useful. So we don't take the mitigation that might apply in India and pretend it's relevant for the Pacific, because of course it isn't. So I just wanted to give you that insight, if you like, into how the bank thinks about this, and the tools and the information we have at our disposal. We share the outcomes of this. That's all completely open. We're always happy to change and discuss. But really what we want to do is to recognize this as an issue, to think about it in the same way as we do other risks, and to make sure that there's appropriate Pacific relevant mitigation to manage any challenges that we can foresee. Thanks. Back to you, Tess.
Thanks, Rose. That's really helpful. And I can see also Kista's comment around that it can be challenging for the supervising engineer to get the GBV expert as well. And that's certainly something I think I've experienced. But I think mostly I think PNG is the only country I've come across where we've really, there's had to be a real focus on making sure that gender expertise is there, because the risk in PNG is kind of so much higher. But I know that it's a challenge. I mean, it's a challenge generally to get GBV expertise in any sector in the Pacific, I'd have to say. So it's not something that's just facing the bank projects. Just to close off on kind of the last set of actions is around responding. So this is what needs to be in place to make sure the project can respond in the case that there's an incident of sexual exploitation, abuse, or harassment related to the project. It also means, the projects can't, there might be a complaint that comes to the project that isn't actually related to the project, but it's, perhaps a woman has come to the project because she's seen that there's some awareness on gender-based violence and she doesn't know where to go, so she's come to the project. So it might not be related to the project, but the project also needs to refer any woman that does come to the project making a complaint of violence against women. So that's what these processes are around. So the bank needs to make sure that there's an effective response mechanism in place to respond to cases of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. And there's kind of two kind of overarching actions. One is around the grievance mechanism having a pathway to receive complaints. So complaints related to any form of violence against women, including sexual exploitation and abuse, are different to responding to maybe your general kind of land complaints or the other kinds of complaints the project might get. There's a lot more sensitivity. There's also a lot more barriers for women to come forward. So there's kind of additional efforts that need to be in place to encourage reporting, but also to make sure that once it is reported, that the processes are survivor-centered and that the safety of the survivor, the rights of the survivor are being prioritised over everything else. So that means in practice, what it's been looking like in the Pacific is kind of having a particular pathway within the grievance mechanism around what will happen if a complaint of sexual exploitation, abuse or harassment is received. And it is generally in more detail than what the more broader complaints mechanism is, because it does kind of step out what needs to happen to make sure the survivor's rights are upheld the whole way through. Then we also the projects need to be able to refer survivors to their external services, which I mentioned before. So this is around making sure that there's information for project sites around what services are available, so that if someone makes a complaint, they can be referred immediately to those external services as well. So the grievance mechanism, I guess, is a little complicated, more complicated than a normal workplace response mechanism, in that the project has a grievance mechanism which will also respond to sexual exploitation and abuse, which means that you have the implementing agencies and the contractors working together within that mechanism. But then the contractor is the one that's responsible for taking disciplinary action against their employee. So the contractor has that responsibility, but the process, I guess, of assessing the complaint and through the grievance mechanism will be broader than just the contractor as well. And that also makes sure that the process is survivor-centred and is following good practice. Depending on the risk level, projects are also supposed to ensure funding is available to support access to services. And this is probably an example of what Rachel's just spoken about that the risk assessment says that this is only necessary for, I think, substantial and high risk projects. But if you're implementing a project in Tuvalu where there's no specialist service providers around violence against women, it becomes more necessary to do this even if it's not a high risk project. So I think the service provision and support to service providers is something that is more of a challenge, I think, in the Pacific, particularly in countries, because we have a number of countries that have either very newly established services that are going to be easily overwhelmed, or in some cases, there's still no specialist service provider at all in country, or the service providers that are there are still very informal. It's not kind of a set up crisis service that you can refer people to. So this, the service provision is a little bit more complicated. I think I'll talk about it a bit more. So just the code of conduct is the key preventative tool that's in place. It's supposed to be signed by all project workers. All project workers are supposed to be inducted on the code of conduct, and there's awareness on the code of conduct with communities both, so they're aware of the code of conduct and they also know how to make a complaint. And then in some cases, the codes of conduct also need to be translated either into local language or also into the language of the workers themselves, if they're foreign workers, for example. I'm just going to talk a little bit. So to support all of this, one of the things that we've done is put together some tools to make it easier for projects to implement the codes of conduct and the training and community awareness. So there is a kind of template code of conduct. There's also some templates for the worker induction and for the community awareness. And I think, part of the push to put some templates together is that I think one of the things that was happening was that there was awareness and training happening of workers and in the community, but it wasn't on the code of conduct. It was kind of more general awareness on gender-based violence. And, we have trainers across the Pacific who can do the training and who can do the training on violence against women and can do awareness on violence against women. But being able to do something specific on the code of conduct is maybe slightly away from their normal kind of training provision that they've been doing previously. So putting together some tools, I guess, helps give some more guidance around what are the key messages that need to go out around the code of conduct to the workers and to the community. And then if the training providers are going to add additional awareness or information onto that, they can. But there's just some, I guess, quality control around making sure that the key messages around the code of conduct are communicated. So there's two different sets of tools that kind of are complementary and in some cases are similar, in other cases vary a little bit. And there's templates for the induction for the worker training. So that includes a briefing note for the facilitators to help them adapt the training for a particular country or a particular project. And so the tools can be used across the region because they are quite, the level of information is, I guess, quite introductory, which means that it can be quite similar across countries. But then there's some tailoring that needs to happen based on the project or based on legislation in the country. So the facilitator notes help with doing that. Then there's facilitator guides, both a PowerPoint and non-PowerPoint, to give guidance to the facilitators. And there's also a sample code of conduct to show what information should get shown in the project sites as well for the project workers. Then there's a similar set of tools to assist with the community awareness. So the briefing note is actually the same across the two tools. It also speaks about where the messages are different between the project workers and the community awareness. So for the project workers in the civil works projects, we're dealing with majority male workforces, which means the message to them is mostly a kind of compliance approach where we're making it really clear these are their expectations, and if you were to break the code of conduct, there'll be consequences. Whereas the message to the communities is telling them about the code of conduct, but it's also trying to encourage the communities to report something if they experience it. There's also a variation for the worker training where you've got, in some projects, I know there's kind of initiatives around increasing women's employment. So there's also variations around having sessions with the female workers as well, which is also around encouraging reporting more than kind of the compliance, because they're more likely to be survivors rather than perpetrators. And then the community awareness also has, so it has the same facilitator guides, and then it also has a sample poster as well that has slightly different pitch in the messaging to display in the communities around how to make a report to the project, what's in the code of conduct. So I just wanted to talk a little bit more around the kind of response in terms of what should be in place to be able to respond to reports of sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment. So as I mentioned, there's the grievance mechanism process and there's the support referral to support services. The key is that the process needs to be survivor-centred. So when I'm talking about survivor-centred, it's around prioritising the rights, needs, safety of the survivor over everything else. So this is around having processes within the grievance mechanism that ensure the survivor's safety, that make sure they're consenting through the process, make sure they're able to choose and influence the decisions, that there's protections around confidentiality so that information about the incident isn't being shared widely, it's only being shared within people who need to know, making sure there's processes to make sure the survivor's informed the whole way through. Support is around the referral to support services, but also if you had project locations where there weren't specialist services, is there a strategy around helping survivors access services, and also around respect to make sure that they're treated with dignity and respect at all times. Also, just back to the grievance mechanism. So another key aspect is that people receiving complaints need to be trained to be able to do so. So there are some specific skills required, or some knowledge and understanding to make sure that you're not unintentionally causing harm to the survivor. Because of the attitudes I mentioned at the beginning, because often we have attitudes that even people with the best intentions, might ask questions or might say things that are inadvertently blaming her or making her feel like it was her fault. So there's just some training to make sure that people are responding in ways that are survivor-centred and that are empowering to the survivor. And you can also see there that the grievance mechanism won't resolve cases of sexual exploitation, abuse and sexual harassment using customary practices of conflict resolution. So your examples of mediation or reconciliation and compensation. And this is, I guess, a little tricky in that sometimes these processes are happening anyway because it might be initiated by the survivor themselves or more commonly by her family who'll ask for these processes. But the key, I guess, is that the projects can't use those processes as a resolution. So if that process is happening, it doesn't mean that all these other processes around the grievance mechanism don't need to happen. So there needs to be, you know, the accountability within the grievance mechanism, disciplinary action taken as well. So any customary process that happens that is initiated by the survivor or her family is not kind of a part of the grievance mechanism, and the projects themselves shouldn't be initiating those processes as a form of conflict resolution, if that makes sense. Okay, just a couple more. I think I've already spoken to this. One of the big challenges in the Pacific is the limited services. So it means that even though the risk rating might be low, there might still need to be a support to consider support to service providers. So whether that's strengthening an existing service provider or whether that's resourcing an existing service provider in recognition that in some locations they're limited or they have very limited resources, or they might kind of still be growing in their role and need capacity building. So maybe there's an opportunity to kind of provide some capacity building as well in recognition of support that they're also giving to the projects as well. And I guess just to flag, you know, in the Pacific, we're dealing with really small countries, and in most cases, we're dealing with one specialist service provider in country. There'll be one kind of crisis centre or one safe house, or so there's also a need to make sure we're coordinating across projects to make sure that if there's support going to service providers or also all the requests for training, that that's being done in a coordinated way, because in some cases we're dealing with really small services that have limited capacity to absorb all the requests that come on them, and they can get frustrated pretty easily because it's not just the World Bank coming and asking them for things, and it's not just World Bank consultants. So being really conscious that, you know, this is just a small part of what they do. And this is just my last kind of closing. You know, I think the World Bank can contribute really positively to efforts to end violence against women in the Pacific. But I think there just needs to be a little bit of caution, because generally speaking, the World Bank aren't experts in this field. And there's been people who have been doing this work for a lot longer in the region. Most of them are from the region. And there's a real need to make sure that anything that is happening in ways that supports the work they've been doing, that is respectful of them, that builds on that work. So just, I guess, as closing, that the work that the World Bank's doing should contribute to and align to and strengthen the broader efforts to end violence against women in the Pacific. So this means things like understanding what's already happening and not duplicating anything, and looking for opportunities to build on what's already happening. Consulting with the specialist service providers, but not wasting their time. So not consulting with them when you don't need to, or being really specific about what you're asking them for when you're asking for their time, recognizing that they're asked all the time to give so much to people, and often they get very little in return, if anything at all. Using local trainers. There are trainers across the region. There's a network of trainers within the Pacific Women's Network to End Violence Against Women who can do the training of project workers, who can do your community awareness. So using and building on those existing resources. And when strengthening service providers, making sure that it's being done collaboratively and with other development partners. So there's other donors and development partners who are investing quite heavily in service provision over the last few years. So also making sure that we're working collaboratively with others in the space as well. Okay, I think that's it from me. Over to you. Any questions, comments?
Thanks, Tessa. Any comments? Open the floor to everybody out there in the region. Let's get some heartbeats kicking in. We've got a comment from, what's this one? Okay, yes, I think everybody can see that. Kisa mentioned in small island development states, it can be challenging for a supervising engineer to find a gender-based violence expert locally. Awareness and education of the subject should be increased. To that, Rachel replied, thanks, Kisa, absolutely, and perhaps even more so when activities are taking place in outer islands. Most services are located in the capital or main cities. So remote location is a question in the risk assessment, which may indicate the risk is higher. Got a comment from Rebecca Ramsey of the World Bank. In rural contexts, the chief or church leader could be involved in grievance redress on sexual exploitation and abuse, sexual harassment issues at the local level outside of the bank projects. Are these institutions ever engaged as part of the response? Any examples? Or are all sexually exploited and abused and sexual harassment grievances always addressed through the police or from the main city? So perhaps Rebecca is posing that comment question for the folks out there. And if anyone has any contribution, please do so. Otherwise, any comments? Any other questions and observations?
If I can jump in around the room with some of the kind of those customary or community mechanisms and conflict resolution. So it touches on, I think, what I was speaking with around before, that we know that these mechanisms are in place and there is potential to use those mechanisms, but generally speaking, they haven't worked to uphold the rights of women. So generally speaking, the mechanisms that happen around conflict resolution in community, it's not often around prioritizing what's happened to the survivor. It might be prioritizing harmony between the two families or harmony of the community more broadly. So often survivors are kind of forced to participate in processes or pressured to participate in processes. And often the outcome of those processes aren't really about making sure that she's okay or making sure that there's been a remedy that's in her best interest. So it's why we generally, for also crisis services that work in this space, will tend to not rely on those mechanisms because often they haven't worked for women. There are exceptions, like there are, I've seen examples where those mechanisms have been built up to be really accountable, and to uphold the rights of survivors. But I do think it takes a lot of effort and it takes a lot of accountability. And where I've seen it work is where there's kind of an attachment with a women's crisis centre or a women's rights kind of organisational group who are working really closely with the community leadership around that mechanism. So it's not, I think there's some exceptions where you have kind of community leaders that take it upon themselves to do things differently. But generally, I think trying to use them, if we're using them, we need to make sure that the mechanism is really upholding the rights of women. And when it comes to sexual violence in terms of sexual assault, really it should be a criminal matter and not be put through those processes as well. So those processes can be more appropriate, I guess, if the incident was maybe a less severe form of violence that wouldn't be kind of captured under criminal law. But once we're in the space of kind of sexual assault, it really should be, put into the formal justice system.
Thanks, Tessa. Got a comment by Sally Peter from Solomon Islands. In a case that the gender-based violence ends up as a police case, when and where in the grievance redress mechanism or the World Bank process should stop and hand over to the police?
Yeah, good question. I've seen some workplace policies sometimes say that a report will get made to the police and then we'll wait for the outcome. The reality is in the Pacific, sexual violence cases take on average, I think, 2 years to get through the court system. So if we're to wait for that resolution, the person's contract is probably going to expire in the time that the case is being put through the system. One thing to highlight, though, is that the police process is different to the grievance mechanism. So the police process is dealing with a breach of the law. So if a survivor goes to the police, that's then going through an investigation and prosecution process that the police and the OPP and the courts are following. The grievance mechanism is dealing with the breach of the code of conduct. So it's a workplace process around disciplinary action against the worker for breaking the code of conduct. And the kind of standard of evidence is not the same. A criminal case is, beyond reasonable doubt. A workplace assessment is the likelihood that it happened. So based on the information we have, is it likely that the incident occurred? If the answer is yes, you can take disciplinary action. So the two processes kind of can be complementary, but they also happen alongside each other. And even if there's a police process, there should still be disciplinary action taken as well. I hope that answers your question, Sally.
Thank you, Tessa. I think it does. Any question? Anybody else wants to have a go? Well, I think everybody enjoyed listening, Tessa, and I think a lot of them really understood the contents of your presentation, judging by comments. We've got a comment from Wendy Lee, developing a specific pathway for sexual exploitation and abuse and sexual harassment complaints within the grievance redress mechanism is difficult. To find women focal points, to keep complaints confidential, and to brief tribunals. So very good comment, Wendy. We all agree.
And it's more difficult when you're working in male-dominated sectors where there's not many women employed by the contractors. So in those cases,
it can be very difficult in in small societies to keep these things confidential. It's very difficult to find women who have the skills that can take on the receiving of the complaints, because they're not normally in the higher levels of the hierarchy of their implementing organizations. And so you end up with a project manager, a male project manager, or a director of an organization trying to take on these very sensitive things, and they have not a clue because they haven't had any training, and they have the same attitudes as the society around them. And so even whether these are paper-based, where people have to record their complaints on forms, or whether they have to put them into a computer, and who has access to that information, and how you keep it survivor-centered. It's not an easy task. It's quite difficult.
Yeah, it is. And I think there's strategies around some of these things. Like I know for some countries we're using women focal points from outside the kind of contractors, because there aren't any within the actual project. So it's using kind of services or women's activists as focal points who can provide some of those roles. But I also think, from the grievance mechanism, I think it's probably fair to say that it's still kind of developing how to do it best for the Pacific. And it at least the support I've been giving, it is different for each country, like in terms of the best way to approach it and what resources are there that can be drawn on. But I think it is a real challenge that the sectors are, it's incredibly challenging, and it's new, and it's something that people are not so comfortable with. So it's challenging, but I think we're progressing through it.
All right, thanks, Tessa. Good comment. Any more questions or comments? Let's continue this on the PNEA. We've got a comment from Patrick. Tessa, as an engineer, even though I do come across violence during our daily projects work, I kind of don't have time or experience in engaging myself in the situation in addressing it. But after this session, I feel confident that I might actually care to do something if the situation emerges. Well, at least now we've managed to convince, and I think the learning is that's taken place today. And I think for the most of us, we came in with our own sort of baseline. And like for me, I could honestly say that I've learned a lot from Tessa, and some of the things that you've talked about, Tessa, that I need to think about. So, in terms of, how to look, what to look out for, not just from the World Bank side, but also from the end of the project side. When you're looking out for, I think the best thing is how to look out to screen gender-based violence, the risks, associated with gender-based violence, sexual exploitation and abuse, and sexual harassment. So I think, to me, that's really good. I think anybody else has any questions? I think we're done. We've just sort of come onto the hour. I've got a few announcements to make, but at the end, I would invite Rachel and from the World Bank and Ratu Jope from SPREP to say their closing remarks. Now, I just want to say a bit before we get to that stage. As you all know, today is the final webinar, and of the second round of training under the Pacific Learning Partnership for Environmental and Social Sustainability. I'm taking time to say that out loud because the worth of this exercise is that we're bringing partners together that operates in the similar space of the EIA and safeguards, such as the World Bank, the ADB, and SPREP, and the University of South Pacific, to coordinate effectively to deliver these sort of trainings. And as you can see, throughout the 8 modules, we've had cooperation between SPREP, World Bank, and ADB. So this is the value of the Pacific Learning Partnership. It's bringing these giants together and delivering their expertise in a coordinated fashion so that folks like you out there are able to access it fairly easy in this webinar format. So obviously there are other ways you can access it, but this, I would say, is the most critical and most important value for me for this PLP. Now, having said that, I just want to go through, now that we're at the end, go through what you learned. What are the things that we talked about? After learning the 8 modules, what have we learned? So let me go through what the partners have helped you with. So I'll talk about, I'll start off with SPREP. So in the beginning, we've got module 9 and 10. SPREP was able to provide learning for all of us on how to apply geographical information system and remote sensing in an EIA studies, and that was really great. And they also took on the module 10 and helped us to understand how to prepare responsible terms of reference for EIA studies and provide guidance tips for selecting and managing EIA consultants. Obviously, we had contributions from other partners. I think I remember Rachel was there and she contributed to that as well. And then we had the Asian Development Bank who led the module 14 and 15 and really was to sort of really train us on about the key features that create an effective environmental monitoring and management planning process and an actual plan, and focusing a lot on what are the best practices for monitoring and reporting throughout the project lifecycle. And if you remember, Alan provided a lot of examples from within the region, where project that he has been involved in, and he explained the various aspects of where we provide monitoring and reporting functions all around the project lifecycle. And finally, we've got the World Bank. And so the World Bank led us with 4 modules, modules 11, 12, 13, and 14. We talked about the use of the mitigation hierarchy and severity probability matrix in an environment and social managing planning process. I know Rachel led that training. We learned a lot. We also heard from colleagues Joyce and Dr. Rebecca on how to use World Bank tools to carry out a stakeholder mapping exercise for engagement planning, and how to use World Bank participatory tools to design and manage land use, land access issues for infrastructure projects. And then today's session, which is really, and I've learned a lot, talking about gender-based violence, sexual exploitation and abuse, and sexual harassment in a context of a project environment. So that's what you learned. I want to thank the partners for giving their time and preparing the training materials, which we all benefit from. So can I get everybody else to put on their video, and please join me to thank the partners, because it is an important aspect. All the trainers that come in, please put on your video. I'd like to see your level of appreciation. And now it's our turn to ask the partners to please put their hands together for the participants. So I want to All right, so thank you very much. Hopefully, you learned a lot. I know I did. And hopefully there will be other future rounds of training coming your way. As a matter of, intrigue, I've asked Ivan to look at the level of participation across the modules, and he's quickly put that together. And in terms of the highest level of participation, the prize goes to the first module, Module 9, which was led by SPREP, the application of geographical information system and remote sensing for EIA studies. That was a good launch of the second round. This is followed by the World Bank, how to carry out a stakeholder mapping for engagement planning. So that's excellent. And then we've got, essentially, we're looking at 55 on average, 50 to 55 on average. My math could be wrong, but this is what I'm seeing, 50 to 55 on average throughout the whole module. So, I would say that is an excellent turnout. So I want to thank you all for taking the time. And this is a testament that these sort of trainings is something that you're asking for. And it's of value to you. So thank you very much. I thank Tess. One slight announcement. So this is my final day for the PLP. There will be my replacement will be on board soon, and that will be communicated to you whenever in due course. I'm pretty sure very soon. So I also want to thank you for the level of support and your cooperation. I really appreciate it. It's made this community of practitioners or professional EIA, ESS professional, very effective group of people to work with and to deliver the trainings. There are other parts of the capacity building training PLP will roll out, so look out for that. Other than that, Rachel, can I hand over to you for your final comments before we close, and then I'll hand over to Ratu Chopu from the World Bank.
Great, thank you, Mia Palo. And look, I won't say much. I just wanted to sort of reflect a little bit on this training. We started this Pacific Learning Partnership around 3.5 years ago, and obviously the world was a very different place then, and the intention was to do this face to face, and it took quite a pivot for us to think about virtual training, but I think it has been such an excellent experience, and the numbers Mia Pello has spoken about hopefully reflects the fact that this is really useful for you as participants as well. So there will be more training next year in the first half of the year, so please do look out for that. We are really keen to hear your feedback. You'll receive a SurveyMonkey form after you've closed off this call, and any of the sessions that you've attended, this one, any previously, it's really fantastic when you share your feedback, because it helps us plan for future sessions, and it also helps us improve this sort of over time. So please do remember to do that. It's really important for us to learn about the things that you want us to help you understand, but also to check if there's things that we're doing that don't work, and then we can make sure we avoid those in future. I wanted to extend my thanks to the partnership, to SPREP, to ADB, to USP. It's been a really excellent sort of session to do this, particularly to SPREP. I'd like to thank you particularly for hosting these sessions. As you can see, the room and the facilities and all the arrangements that SPREP have made to bring this training to us all virtually, I think is absolutely outstanding, and I'm extremely grateful for all your support and efforts on this. I also want to thank Mia Pello. It's very sad that this is his last day. He's done a really excellent job at facilitating all of these sessions, both last year and this year. So thank you so much, Mia Pello. We are going to miss you, but I'm sure our paths will cross again in future, and we'll have the opportunity to continue to speak to you. So maybe you'll be a participant when we do this again next year. So thank you so much. And really just to thank you from the World Bank's perspective, we really love doing this kind of work. I really want to encourage you to reach out to us if there's things that we talk about that you don't understand or that you want to tell us that help us do our work better. This has been a great learning experience for me as well, because I learn from all of you, your experiences, your realities. It's not theory on paper. It's not dry policy. We're really all trying to support the Pacific to have better outcomes. And we all, I certainly need to learn as much as anyone, because I think it's hugely important, that particularly because I haven't been able to travel to the Pacific for a couple of years. So I'm really grateful for everyone's attendance. I really look forward to seeing you again next year at the upcoming sessions, which we will share with you in January. And I just wish you a very good Christmas season, and I hope you are all having a break, and I look forward to seeing you again in 2022. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Rachel. Latu.
Thank you very much, Rachel. And I think all what I need to say, you've said it. And yes, I, on behalf of the Director General of SPREP, would like to take this time to again thank you sincerely, Rachel, for always being there as a World Bank partner in supporting my good friend here who will be leaving us. And I do hope that in our upcoming meetings, we'll be able to recruit the replacement for Mepelo, so that we continue this excellent momentum. And I totally support your appreciation and acknowledgement to the engagement of our participants. Yes, for the information of our participants, is PrEP through your Environment Monitoring Governance Program is undertaking this project steering committee meeting. And one of the highlights that we are sharing with them tomorrow morning is the level of engagement of you through this partnership in raising capacity of the Pacific Island countries in terms of EIA and environment social safeguards. Yes, to you, Rachel, and our ADB partners and USP, thank you for that, for always being there for the last 8 modules, and even way back 2020 when we started this. And I totally agree with Rachel. After serving in the Fiji government for so many years, I realized that I didn't know everything. And from the presentation from the last 16 modules, I realized that I still have huge to learn, and especially from the questions and the contribution from you participants. Thanks, Rachel, for raising that. Yes, we'll continue with this in the coming year, in the new year. And please, participants, we will be updating you through our Pacific Network on Environment Assessment, and also when our new official comes in to continue with this good work that we are doing. And yes, this is our last meeting, and Christmas is just around the corner. I take this time to, on behalf of the Director General of SPREP, to wish you all the best. And as most of you will know, but to those of you who didn't know, that our current Director General will be finishing off in April, and our incoming new Director General will be starting around about the 3rd or 4th April next year. So I would like to end on that note, and I would like to say again, thank you, Binagaboleo and Fafatailawa. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Minakaratu, just my personal thanks to Rachel. Thanks, you've been a fantastic job of course over the course of since 2019. I want to thank Easter. I want to thank Dr. Jope. I want to thank Gregory, and I want to thank Ivan. Thank you very much. They've been an excellent host here at SPREP, and I very much appreciate it. And thank you for all the support you give for these webinars. It makes a big difference. All right. Well, that brings me to say thank you and wishing you all a very Merry Christmas. Please do look out for the next round of trainings. Look after yourself. Take care. We'll talk again. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.